And welcome everybody.
Hey.
Hi, I'm Karl and I'm a small church pastor. And it's great to be in the room with others who can say the same. I'm gonna get right into this, and I am gonna download a bunch of information. I'm gonna do two talks. I'm gonna open it now and we're gonna close it. I'll close it at the end. At the end, I've got two illustrations and we'll spend some time walking slowly through it. Right now we're gonna zip through and we're gonna give you a whole bunch of stuff. So on your tables, grab this. For those of you live streaming, hi everybody. We do have a bunch of folks that are watching our live stream right now, and we welcome you. It's good to have you here. And we're going to give you some detailed information about things later, but for right now, I just want to move into the process that we're looking at here right now. Like I said, hi, I'm Karl, and I'm a small church pastor. I've been a small church pastor for about 25 years, but I didn't know I was one until about 4 or 5 years ago. And the reason I didn't know I was a small church pastor for the 20 or so years that I was because I thought I was a big church pastor who hadn't arrived yet. And there's a big difference between being a small church pastor and thinking you're a big church pastor who hasn't arrived yet. One is freeing and liberating, and the other is frustrating and irritating. And I thank God that He helped me move from frustration and irritation into liberation and freedom by a simple acknowledgement, which is why we even do simple things like the name tag. Because being able to sit there and go, hi, I'm, insert your name here, and I'm a small church pastor, is a really liberating moment for a lot of folks. I've even talked to some of you this morning about your moment where you said that and where you came to that realization, and the gratefulness to God for all of that. I think the reason that I thought didn't think I was a small church pastor also was because I thought being a small church pastor was a bad thing to be. The reason I thought it was a bad thing to be is because I thought small churches were bad things. Not really. If you'd asked me straight up, is it bad to have a small church? I wouldn't have said, yes, it's bad, it's awful. I wouldn't have said that, but I lived that way, I acted that way, I ministered that way. And I did so in large part because I'd been told that for a lot of years. Take a look around for the last 30 years at all the books on pastoral leadership. What are they about? Probably the most common phrase used is the 200 barrier. I don't want to see another article or web article or book with the phrase 200 barrier in it. I don't want to, but I keep seeing them even still. Everybody keeps telling us how to break through the 200 barrier. And one, why 200? Why do we just pick the number out of a hat? And two, why do we call it a barrier? I do know why the 200 is there. You do have to pastor a church differently once you push past 200. It has to become a different type of administrative process. I get that. But why is one better than the other is what I started questioning. And I came to the point where I realized that the reason I didn't believe I was a small church pastor is because I started believing something that I called the Grasshopper Myth. And so let's ask and answer that question that Jeff brought up a little earlier. What is the Grasshopper Myth? Where did I come up with such a strange title for that? And by the way, it is interesting, when you do have the website and when you do have a book on Amazon, you get to see the search terms that people use to find your stuff. And I've disappointed a lot of insect enthusiasts. It is really interesting to see those terms where, they're using all this scientific terminology, and they found my book, and I don't think any of them actually ordered it, but it was really interesting to kind of watch that kind of a traffic. What is the Grasshopper Myth? Here's what it is. It's the false impression that our small church ministry is less than what God says it is because we compare ourselves with others. Comparison is the problem. And I get the phrase grasshopper from Numbers 13, 32, and 33. All the people we saw there are of great size. This is the report of the spies who came back from the promised land. We seemed like grasshoppers. Where? In our own eyes. The problem begins in the mirror. The problem does not begin at how others look at me. Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. It begins in our own eyes. And because we look like grasshoppers in our own eyes, we look the same to them. And so we put that vibe out there. And we get back what we're putting out. I'm no good. My church is too small. There's not enough. How many of us have complained to the people in front of us that there aren't enough people in front of us. I hate to admit it, but I've been guilty of that in the past. And I can just imagine them sitting there going, what are you yelling at me for? I showed up. Right? And what does that do to the church, to their attitudes, to their ideas about who God is, and about, as Bob so beautifully mentioned earlier on, about this dynamic of fellowship and of presence. And I love that you use the word hanging out. I wrote a piece a while ago called hanging out is holy. It's a phrase we use at our church all the time. Hanging out is holy. You may know it as fellowship, but I'd rather hang out with friends than go to a fellowship meeting, so I just use the word hanging out. It's the same thing, but it's just a term that makes us, I think, a little more comfortable. So here, that's what the Grasshopper Myth is about. And then I want to jump into these three undeniable truths, three undeniable realities of pastoral ministry. We're going to give these to you real quick. Reality number one, 80 to 90% of pastors will never pastor a church larger than 250 people. Let that truth sink in for a moment. We know that because the statistics show it, and it's never changed since Jesus said, I will build my church. The average size church in the world is about 50 or 60 people. The average size church in America is about 80. That means half of them are more than 80, and half of them are smaller than 80. And 90% of the churches in the world are less than 100 people. 80% of the churches in the world are less than 200. The other way around. 90% less than 200, 80% less than 100. So if you're a lead pastor, you are going to pastor. You'll never pastor a church more than 250, 80 to 90% of us. Reality number two, corresponding with this, is this. 99.9% of pastors will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. If you're going to be a lead pastor, that is. Staff pastor, that's different. You're more likely to be on a large church if you're a staff pastor because they're the ones who can afford you. That changes. But if you want to be a lead pastor, in fact, the only way you're not going to pastor, if you want to be a lead pastor, the only way you're not going to pastor a small church is if your father is a megachurch pastor. And that's not to put that down. There have been some good pastoral transitions because they've been able to train father to son, and that's great. But that's the reality of it. And so you've got the Barnetts in Phoenix, and you've got Andy Stanley, and you've got you can name it, and you've got the tragedy of the Crystal Cathedral recently that wasn't even able to work with their family, and the family fell to pieces over it. And that's not an indictment of bigness or of that family. That's just a sad reality. But unless your dad's a megachurch pastor, you're going to pastor a small church for at least a certain period of time. And so shouldn't we figure out how to do that well, since 99.9% of us are going to do that for at least a certain amount of time? That's a big part of what we want to be doing here in workshops like this. And here's reality number three, which I think we really need to get into our hearts and spirits and understand this. You can pastor a small church well without settling for less. And that, I think, is the biggest struggle when you even mention the word small church. I've heard back from people who've read my book or read my blog, and they've gone to their bishop or they've gone to the superintendent or whatever your tribe calls the boss. And they come back, and many of them come back, and the boss, the superintendent, the bishop, or whatever, often will say things like, oh, I don't believe there are any small churches. Who's the other? RI pastor one. And I got a name tag that he says it. And what they mean is there are no insignificant churches, but small and insignificant are not the same thing. We can be small and significant. We can be small and great. We can be small and healthy. You can pastor a small church well, and it doesn't mean you're settling for less. And that's the struggle a lot of us have. None of us wants to settle for less. You wouldn't have wasted the gasoline to come today. You wouldn't be sitting in your office watching live stream today and taking time out of your day to watch this, to participate in this, if you were willing to settle for less. And the good news is, being small, you can be small and not settle for less. 90% of the churches in the world, like I said, are under 200. 80% are under 100. And so here's the question that I asked myself about 5-6 years ago. Somebody gave those stats, and like out of nowhere in my brain, this question popped up. And the question was, what if that's not a bad thing? Because every time you've heard that, right? 90% of churches in the world under 200, 80% are under 100. We've got to fix this, is always the next phrase. And my question was, wait a minute, what if that's not a bad thing? It's always been that way. What if when Jesus said, I will build my church, what he had in mind wasn't the world filled with cathedrals and big box store churches only? Both of those are great. But what if what he had in mind was kind of the mix we've got now? A handful of really big ones, a whole bunch of mid-size and bigger, and a ton of little ones just scattered all over the globe, tucked into every single corner of the world. What if that's not a problem to fix? What if that's part of a strategy that God wants us to use? But we can't even think that way unless we get this idea into our brain that a small church can be a great church. So from that, the title of this first talk that I'm doing here now is, I'm going to ask us what it means to think like a great church. We're going to talk about thinking like a great small church. So one of the titles of one of my chapters is Stop Thinking Like a Big Church. Because if you're not a big church, thinking like a big church can really hurt your church. But what does it mean? How do we start thinking like a great small church? And I'm going to throw a bunch of principles at you, one after another, so get those pens ready because they're going to get hot quick. You start writing all this stuff down. There's an old illustration that I love, and I'm going to use kind of as the basis for my next several points. There's a guy who walks up to somebody and he's been shooting arrows against the barn, and he sees the guy shot 5 arrows against the side of the barn, and each one of them has hit a bullseye dead center. He says, wow, you're a good shot. How'd you do that? He goes and pulls all the arrows out, goes to the other side of the barn where there's nothing on it, shoots the 5 arrows randomly, they hit randomly, and he goes up and he paints a bullseye where each arrow hits. I think that's how we ought to do mission statements at our church. Here's what we need to do. Discover what your church does well, and then do it on purpose. See, we went through this whole got to write a mission statement down thing about 20 years ago, right? Everybody had to work on a mission statement. And we all, because it had to be unique to our church, and yet they all ended up sounding like Bill Hybels' mission statement somehow. Which is a great mission statement for them. But we all figured, oh, that's got to be our mission statement too. No, you're not there. You're not in that church. You're not in that place. You're not doing that ministry. But we all wrote out these mission statements, and they're sitting somewhere tucked back into a constitution and bylaws or something, and we haven't looked at it for years. And we can't figure out why these mission statements didn't transform our churches. And it's because we were attaching something to it that we weren't able to hit. We were putting a target up in a spot that we weren't able to aim at. Instead, what if we figured out what we're doing well anyway? This is the spot I keep hitting. Why don't I put a bullseye there? Years ago, we discovered that at our church. We do 2 things really well. One, we help de-churched and discouraged and hurt, and people who've been hurt by the church come back to Christ again. We re-church the de-churched well. So we've got a slow incoming door. I don't have the gift of evangelism. I can get up and preach a Greg Laurie sermon word for word, give his altar call word for word, and nada. I can't, it doesn't work. I don't have the gift. I have the command to evangelize, and so I follow that command, but I don't have the gift. But I do find that what we do have a gift for is helping the hurting, people who've been hurt by the church, and for some reason they're attracted to us, but that's a slow front door. And the other thing we do really well is we train people and send them back out again, younger people and older people. And so we've got a pretty sizable back door, but it's a back door extending people out of the ministry. And we discovered a few years ago, we do this well. We kind of fell into this. We didn't try for it. It just turns out, well, that's what we're doing. So we've decided to do that on purpose. Let's make that who we are. Let's make that what we do. Since we're doing it already, let's just do it really well. And part of the challenge is, but wait a minute, if we do that really well, we won't grow really fast, because neither one of those things grows a big church fast. And we had to be okay with, yeah, but that's what God has called us to do. It's obvious that's what He's called us to do, because that's what we're doing already. That's what just kind of comes naturally. If you don't know what you do well, start experimenting. Try stuff. We didn't fall into these 2 things automatically. We tried so many things for so many years. It's in my book. I told you at one point I was ready to apologize to the board about another failure. And in the middle of apologizing, one of the board members interrupted me and went, "Pastor, stop." And I went, "Oh, that's it. I'm dead. They're going to fire me right now." And the board member said, Pastor, it's okay. We give you permission to make mistakes. At least you're trying. And I've taken that permission and I've ran with it. And I've given that permission to others. And if you give yourself and your church permission to experiment and make mistakes, you'll hit a lot of bad targets, but after a while you start realizing, wait a minute, but we tend to hit that zone quite a bit. What if we made that our target? What if we did that on purpose now? And I really think there's a lot in that can help. For the next point, there's a bit of an illustration. Move from the arrow illustration to there's an old illustration about closets, and there's a rule that people have when they live in big cities like New York where they don't have much space, that for every article of clothing you buy new, you should toss out the oldest thing that you got in your closet. You stay relevant that way, you don't get overcluttered, you stay fresh with your styles, and I, of course, being the style maven that I am, know how to do that. I think we ought to adapt that for the church. I think we ought to use the closet rule for ministries. Don't add a new one until you drop the old one. And particularly for smaller churches. Just like if you've got a small closet, don't add a new piece of clothing until you've dropped an old one. We don't have the room for it, first of all. I think simple is better in smaller churches. And I think what we often do is we go to conferences and conventions like this, we get a great new idea, we go home and we try to push it, but everybody at home is going, but we're already busy with everything else. We can't add a new one. We just don't have the time, the energy, the whatever. And then we start complaining that they're just not trying, they just don't care, they're heel draggers, they're vision killers, or whatever. And usually we've just worn them out. Don't add a new one until you're ready to toss an old one. Now, sometimes the tossing of the old one is, this is now going so well that it's now consolidated under this particular area of ministry. It doesn't take all of our front brain work to do it anymore. But make sure that's happened. As a church grows, yes, you can adapt and add more ministries, but you can only do it because it stopped being front brain, it started being back brain. It's now sitting on the shoulders of volunteers who love it, who are called to it, who are passionate about it, who are good at it. And now at least it's off of the pastor's shoulders, and the new people who are going to take on a new ministry aren't that old group that's now covering the other one. But I think for a lot of churches, it needs to literally be that. It needs to literally be, okay, if I'm going to add a new one, which one am I tossing? I really think we need to start thinking that way. And then we have less worry about being stuck back in the 1980s or 1990s and we're still doing the same things the way we used to do it then. Take the old one out. All right, and here's one of the ways I think we can decide that for our own churches. I call this a workshop because I want you to actually take some of this and work it for your own situation rather than just downloading information. So I want you to ask and actually answer. As I'm talking, as other things happen today, answer these two questions and actually write them down. Question number one, what does your church do well that you would like to do more of? What target do you hit fairly regularly and you go, that'd be great if we could hit that even more often or more exactly? What do you do well that you'd like to do more of? And secondly, what does your church do poorly that you'd like to do less of? The questions are almost too simple, aren't they? Really? That's all? Yeah. Most of the aha moments come with things that are almost too simple. And I guarantee you, a lot of churches around the world would be transformed if we take those two questions seriously. What do we do well that we'd like to do more of, and what do we do poorly that we should do less of? You start adding new clothes to the front of the closet, pulling old clothes out of the back of the closet. And the whole thing gets refreshed and updated and vibrant and new. And I seriously, start asking yourself that and start writing those things down. Take them home, look at them, pray about them. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually apply that to the church. How do I bring this now to my board that really loves that old thing? We'll actually talk about that a little bit later. Okay. Along with this, another question to kind of ask, and you can write this in, is if you were starting a church today, is there anything you're now doing in your current church that you wouldn't start doing? That probably belongs on the back of the closet list then. If you were starting a church today, what are you currently doing in your church that you wouldn't start doing now if you weren't doing it already? You need to seriously look at that. I'm all for trimming the fat. Again, Bob talked about it earlier. Lean and mean, man. between it. Here's our next principle to look at. I think we in small churches especially need to move out of a destination mindset and more into a process orientation. I've noticed, now that I'm in my mid-50s and I have all this experience, I'm finding that experience matters less than it ever has, and it ticks me off. Because I really worked hard to gain all this experience, and now I'm finding out that the experiences I had 20 years ago actually hold me back as often as they propel me forward. And I need to learn to be adaptable. And there are a lot of situations where adaptability to the new is more valuable than experience. Now, I'm not saying experience has no value. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying experience mixed with the adaptability and knowing when to apply my experience and knowing when to simply adapt and lay the experience that is actually hindering my mindset from thinking new thoughts. When do I lay it aside? But what I mean by move out of a destination mindset and into a process orientation is this. For years, the way we used to do church was you'd go out and you'd buy a big pulpit and it would be bought by such and such a family and it would have a plaque on it and it was going to sit there for generations. And every pew had the same thing, a plaque, because it was bolted to the floor. It was never going to move. But take a look around the room today. You can go to our church and see the same thing. Adaptability, moving, changing all the time. You'll meet him later, Barry Garcia, my youth pastor for 21 years now. And he's got a great ability to see new ways and new ways to do things. And he's put up a beautiful stage at our church that I don't think cost $150 to put all the stuff on the walls up there. And it looks beautiful and it works. But I know that sucker 18 months from now, it's not going to be there. There's going to be something else up. Adaptability, move, change. And the idea behind it is this. We've had this destination orientation in church ministry for too long. What is my best Sunday school system? What is my best order of service? What is my best building? What is my best whatever? And I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do that method, and I'm going to do it forever. And then, when it is time to change, we don't see it, or we have this World War III in our church trying to change it because everybody else has this destination mentality. We spent all this money and all this time buying this, and now you want us to toss it just 4 years later? But if instead of having this destination mindset, we have a process orientation, here's what happens. You look at the process, and it's the closet picture again. I have a process of I buy something new, I toss something old. And that process then can stay for decades because it allows for change. It allows for adaptability. In our church, we went for years with no money, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff. Deferred maintenance is the lovely term they use at our building, right? But once our deferred maintenance is caught up, we've already decided on and put into place a plan for continual update. And the idea will be, what's the oldest part of the facility? We're going to update that. And once it's updated, then we're going to take a look around and go, now what's the oldest part of the facility? Let's work on that one next. And that was fixed, and then we'll go on now what's the oldest part of the facility? And I think we ought to do the same thing with ministries. We need to look around and see the oldest, and it's not necessarily about age, but at least reassess. Okay, we should always be reassessing something in our facility if we have one. And I know I'm talking to a room full of guys, a lot of them don't. But we should also be looking very carefully at our ministries the same way. What is our most tired, least valuable ministry at the moment? And how can we reassess it? How can we update it? Do we need to toss it entirely? My staff has been told several times, if we're not reassessing how we do each ministry, at least as often as Microsoft comes out with a new Windows, we're behind the curve. Because that's about the pace of change now. Now, I'm not saying we toss everything every 3 to 4 years when Microsoft comes out with new Windows, but reassessing it at least at that pace. So the place we sit then is not a spot, it's not a destination, but it's a process. A change process that we become comfortable with. And because constant change when we don't know why we're changing just puts everybody off. Nobody can work that way. But change because we've designed a process for this change and everybody's comfortable with the process, we have the comfort with that. And you can use a closet metaphor, you can use whatever metaphor you want that works. Everybody goes, oh, this is according to the process that we've set in place. Change is a part of the way we do it. And for smaller churches especially, I think that mindset can be really, really helpful. In a big church, we just do what the pastor says. But in a small church, it's more relationally driven. And so people have to buy into it. Out of a destination mindset into a process orientation. Next one. I think we need to invest in ministries that, even if they don't add numbers, produce life change. Back in the 1980s, I was pastoring, and for a while in the 1980s, robocalling was the big deal. Anybody pastoring as long as I have will remember in the 1980s, they came around and they said, what you've got to do is you've got to buy this phone system. And if you call 20,000 people, 200 people will show up on Sunday. And that was how they were starting churches. This was the answer for starting churches. It was the answer for growing churches, was driving people nuts at home during dinner with a robocall for the church. And many churches had tried it, and they had planted churches that way, had grown their churches that way, and we had a guy who kept trying to pitch it to me. And it was going to cost like $1,500 to buy the system. This is in the 80s, and I was in a church of 45 people. Put the numbers together, and you know that wasn't going to happen. But it had to happen because that was the answer. And finally, in my frustration and trying to figure it out with him, he said, what is your problem with it? If it does grow the church, then what, money back guarantee or whatever. And there wasn't. But I said, here's the deal. If I'm going to spend $1,500 of our extremely hard-earned money in a church of 45 people in the 1980s, if I'm going to spend $1,500, I'd rather spend it on a divorce recovery workshop or feeding the homeless or doing something that, even if it didn't add numbers, even if it didn't put butts in my seats, I can still say, we fed the homeless. We still did something of value. But if I spend this $1,500 to make the calls and nobody shows up, I've just thrown $1,500 away on nothing. Lost. A more recent example of that, I was at a big church conference not a long time ago, and they had on the screens, as again Bob was talking about on the screens, and their big thing was now video announcements and video intros to your sermons. And we actually tried that for a little bit. We actually put together some surprisingly good videos. But I found out that in a smaller church where the pastor has to at least have hands-on with everything, if not actually do it all myself, I was burning 10 to 15 to 20 hours a week putting together a 1.5 to 2 minute video clip. That is not good stewardship of my time. I was throwing that time away. It didn't make any sense at all. In a big church where you got a full tech team and they love doing that, God bless them, go for it. But it doesn't make sense in a smaller church. And so we just decided we actually did some that were good, but it didn't make any sense because it didn't produce the life change we were looking for. It didn't make any sense to do it, which leads to our next one, which is realize that technical expertise is no substitute for personal relationships. And this will be our last point for this session. Nobody wakes up nobody tomorrow morning and Sunday morning is going to wake up, rub the sleep out of their eyes, and go, I want to see an awesome spectacle of music, staging, and storytelling today. I think I'll go to church. You know why they're not going to say they're going to go to church for that? Because they've got better than we can do in their pocket. It's literally in our pocket now. The best staging, lighting, sound, storytelling, everything that has ever been produced on the face of the earth. I can now press a button with a machine that's in my pocket and get it. Why would I bother going to your church to see you do it worse? Right? Am I lying or am I telling the truth? That's the deal, right? So if they do get out of bed and they do show up at our church, especially if they're showing up at a smaller church, they're not coming to a church of my size because they're expecting awesome lighting, awesome storytelling, awesome staging, total precision, high-tech, whatever. If you walk into a smaller church, nobody in their right mind is walking in there and expecting all of that. What are they expecting if they walk into a smaller church? Relationships. Somebody's going to know me. I'm going to know them. If I don't show up, they're going to notice it. They're going to care. And, you can walk into a big church and be anonymous, but let me tell you, it is brutal to walk into a small church and be anonymous. Oh, don't let that happen. And we don't do it as well as we should either. Right now we're working, and tomorrow we're going to have our first meeting we've changed our ushering team. We used to call them the doorkeepers, which is a great spiritual term, but it sounds like you're taking care of the door. And so we've changed it to the first impressions team. Because that's what it's all about. What's your first impression when you walk in? And even when you know, when you're on the first impressions team, the person who's on that team goes, I know what I'm here for. First impression, relationship. That's what they're coming for. That's what small churches do well. When you ask people why they go to a small church, and I haven't done an official scientific survey, but this is what I found in my conversations, the number one reason they give why people say they like small churches is this: the pastor knows my name. I want to be pastored by a pastor. I want to be able to call up in the middle of the week when something goes wrong and have him or her pray for me. I want to be able to call somebody when I've got a biblical problem and a theological issue. I'm trying to share my faith with my neighbor, whatever it might be. And I don't want to just call a small group leader. I want to call my pastor. Now, some people are fine without being able to do that, and they go to big churches and they get all their spiritual needs met there, and that's why we need big and small, mega and tiny house churches and everybody else. We need all of this in the mix. But there's a large segment of the population, half of the Christians in the world go to a church under 300 people. They're not doing it because they don't have other options. They're doing it because that's where they can get a relationship. And we can do that well, and we need to do it better than we have. So I think for a lot of us, we need to lay aside our technical expertise, realize I don't do it well anyway, and even if I did it awesome, I'm still not going to do it as well as what's on their phone. So let's do the relationships, and let's do that really well. That won't lead you to greatness. That is greatness. All right, and that's my talk for now.